Hello again. Welcome back to Criminology at the University of Nebraska-Kearney with Dr. Kurt Borchardt. This is Chapter 4 of the Siegel text that we're using. I usually skip Chapter 3 on victimology, so that's probably why you don't have it there listed with your other discussions of different chapters, okay? So we'll just proceed forward with Chapter 4. And a class exercise. What I want to do with you first is try a little thought experiment. I'd like you to, if you have a piece of paper for a second, imagine you have an opportunity to steal $1 million. Right? This is a very popular figure for determining wealth in the United States. Everybody wants to be a millionaire or marry a millionaire or lie to people on an island to get to become a millionaire, something like this, right? So $1 million is a preferred goal for a lot of people. You have a chance to steal that, and you have a chance, no chance, 0% chance of getting caught. No chance at all. So you can steal the $1 million, nothing's going to happen to you, right? You don't know where the money is coming from. That's part of it too. And in this hypothetical scenario, I'm asking you to choose one of three things. Would you first, or A, I guess here, would you do it? B, would you think about doing it? Or C, would you not do it? And whatever you choose, if you could write it down, and then you're welcome to include a 1 or 2 sentence explanation about your choice. Okay? Do that for a few minutes, and then come back and start the slides again, and we'll talk a little bit more about the next topic. Okay, now that you've completed the exercise, we can start talking about Siegel's Chapter 4 of his book Criminology, and how what you just did relates to the topic, rational choice theory, the topic of our 4th chapter. There are a couple theorists here who I'll talk with you about briefly, Ceasar Burke and Jeremy Bentham. And these guys, you can see, are coming after the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was the period when superstition and fear often ruled. Religion was very, very important in people trying to make sense of the world and understand things. The church had a lot of power, and there was a fear of Satan. There was a fear of demonic possession, okay, and fears of temptation. And those were dominant explanations for crime. Why did crime happen? Why did terrible deviant acts happen? And these two fellows here are what are called Enlightenment thinkers. And the Enlightenment, I'd like you to know, is an intellectual movement in Western Europe, okay? Happened after 1600, and it had many different thinkers. But their central idea was they broke with previous religion or religious-based explanations, and they were really interested in critical and rational thinking, logic and reason, science, and they were secular, so moving away from religion as a source of truth. Now let's talk a little bit about each of these theorists. Burke was interested in reforming the criminal law of his day, really. And he had ideas like, for example, criminal law should be clear. Everyone should know and understand it. Torture should be abolished. It's a no-brainer for us, but this was a revolutionary idea at this time. The idea also that judges should be impartial. The accused should be allotted time and resources to determine what type of defense they want to pose. There shouldn't be a death penalty, he said. It should be abolished. Also, too, punishment should be quick, certain, and commensurate with the crime. And argued for the notion of social harm as an important thing in determining what counts as crime and what ought to be done about crime. Okay. If we were talking about Jeremy Bentham, Bentham was an interesting fellow. He was a philosopher, he was an economist, He also did some architectural designs, including the panopticon, which is a useful thing to think about in criminology, and I explained that in a previous slide. So these guys, again, were rooted in Enlightenment thought. And the key ideas that they wanted to promote was the notion that people have free will and are utilitarian. Free will means people make choices, and they determine how they should act based on reflection and thought. They're utilitarian. Utilitarian means behavior that's reasonable, purposeful, and based on logic. They're trying to figure out what will bring the greatest good to them. Okay, behavior that's reasonable, purposeful, and rational. That's a good definition of utilitarianism. Okay, so what was the previous idea before Enlightenment thinking? There was this notion of prominence of religion. Okay, and that meant more or less a kind of a determinism. People really couldn't choose. It was basically the idea that God controlled things, right? God was really, in some ways, seen as a puppet master. Okay, God was involved in all of the actions that humans were engaged in, right? And God saw everything. What changed then between this religious view, this deterministic view, and this Enlightenment view, which promoted free will, was a major, major change in thought. And one of the things you can consider is, how did we go from this idea of determinism and demonic possession more to free will and people making rational choices? And the key I'd like you to note in this change is the role of deists, right? Mark there on your slide. Deists were Enlightenment thinkers, and their main characteristic was not thinking of God as a puppet master. They thought of God more as a clockmaker. All right, God made the world perfectly in His image and created humans and the world in a way you could think of as like perfect machines. And then God stepped back. Okay, God made everything perfect, but then allowed all these things to take their course naturally. And so what that did, the creation of deism, was it allowed for keeping religion in place, but it allowed for a God that gave you free will. Okay, free will, that people make choices. All right, and that really opens the door for choice theories. So that leads into the basic premise behind classical criminological theory. Right? So after this demonology, classical criminology comes to the fore, based through Enlightenment thinkers and ideas that Enlightenment thinkers have of reason and rationality. So they come up with a new idea about crime. And the idea is that all people have the potential to be criminal. Right? Everybody has this potential. You, me, all humans. What happens, though, is that we are restrained, usually out of a fear of sanction, punishment, and stigma. Those things inhibit us from committing crime. So, one of the things that you can do is think about your early exercise you did a couple slides ago, and whether or not you would steal $1 million. And I've taught this course many years, for 15 years now actually, and one of the things I've found when I've done this experiment in classes is that usually, almost invariably, people will fall into each of the three categories. In other words, there's someone in each of the three categories. All right. Some people in the past have said that they would do it, and they've given a lot of different reasons for doing it. But some of the themes have been, I wouldn't be caught, there's no punishment. Some people have said, I needed money for spring break. It's available, why not? Some people have said they would think about doing it. And that's an interesting point, because I think that a lot of people, it would probably pass through their mind. And sometimes what happens when I've done this is a coding error issue, where sometimes students say, well, I would think about it, but I would ultimately not do it. So they say, well, I choose B, but then I choose C, which raises fascinating questions about research methods and how we categorize people's information. How should I, as a social scientist, think about, which one is the real choice this person makes, right? Sometimes closed-ended questionnaires don't work very well for understanding thought processes. The last choice, though, C, I wouldn't do it. I always have students who fall into that C category. And the interesting thing, too, about B and C, again, is like maybe why people wouldn't do it. B, some people will say, I wouldn't, or I would think about doing it, maybe, but I don't know who the money is from. And some people would say, C, I wouldn't steal it because I don't know who the money's from, which is interesting, too, because you have to think, well, one semester a student wrote, I would steal it if it was Osama bin Laden's, right? And that relates to this idea, well, okay, maybe you think then stealing from bad people is okay, but stealing from good people is not, which is another fascinating wrinkle in this. But sometimes people, when they choose C in particular, they say things like, I couldn't live with myself. Another thing they might say, which I found fun, is, some people say, well, I was raised on a farm and we just don't do that. Meaning, I guess, that there is some sort of value or belief system that people hold that inhibits them from doing this crime, even though rationally it is a perfect equation for why people might do this, okay? So I've given you basically a setup which takes out the fear of sanction, the punishment, and the stigma. And so in some ways, people, and in this instance, a lot of the people taking this course are criminal justice majors. There are a number of criminal justice majors who would be very tempted to steal and say, yeah, I'd do it. Now here's the funny thing. This, of course, is a hypothetical question. And I was told when I was doing social science research classes that really a hypothetical question is pretty worthless in terms of the information you get. You really have no idea how you would act unless you were in that situation. But it's a chance for you to think through the logic of classical criminology, all right, and some of these assumptions that I just outlined. There are big important themes that come up in these classical theories, and I'm going to go through these each one at a time. Right. We'll talk first a little about deterrence. There's supposed to be two things with deterrence. First, the effect of sanctions should deter, should inhibit people from committing crimes. The second issue is there's what's called specific deterrence, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But specific deterrence is that if you're a known criminal, then there are more elevated penalties usually to prevent you from committing crime. And this idea is that any criminal will have a reasonable, rational response to sanction. Now there's a question, is that true? Do heavier penalties deter people? We'll talk more about that. But the general idea here is that sanctions deter, right? If I throw a temper tantrum as a child and I know I'm going to get spanked for doing it, I may be inhibited from doing that act, okay? The second big area we can talk about, incapacitation, is closely tied to the idea of deterrence. And classical theory credits a large proportion of crime to a small minority of offenders. You might recall the previous chapter we talked a bit about the Philadelphia cohort study, the delinquency in a birth cohort, okay? And that is, again, related strongly to some of the ideas behind classical theories. Incapacitation is a logical response by the state to sanction, because if people are not deterred in the first place, then they probably ought to be isolated and controlled. Right? The death penalty, the third big topic that you can think of under classical theories and the ideas related to them. If you think about the death penalty and you think about the notion of what's called a proportionate response to crime, you'd have to say, well, death is the worst possible punishment a person could receive. Therefore, it needs to be reserved for the worst possible crime. So really, there are usually only two things where the death penalty is invoked in a lot of Western society. And most people know murder. You can sometimes be given the death penalty for that. But another one is treason. If you endanger the vast majority of your citizens in the country you are in, that can, in many cases, warrant consideration of the death penalty. Also, too, we can think about retribution, and the notion of retribution that if there's a crime, violations deserve punishment and retribution, in part there because obviously deterrence didn't work, right? So retribution means that you're not doing a preemptive strike here. You're basically showing people that you mean what you say when you say you're going to punish them, right? And that relates to this last idea, just deserts, which we will talk about more in a minute. But just deserts basically is that the severity of the punishment should be commensurate with the seriousness of the crime itself, right? So here are some of the assumptions behind classical criminological theory. You want to make the cost of crime greater than the rewards. And that makes sense. So you basically scale out what's the punishment to cause someone to think. And if people are rational, and that's a big question, then they will think twice about doing those things. One great example I like to think of for most people who live in Nebraska is if you've ever driven on Interstate 80 and you see those signs. They say speed limit. Usually they say 75. And then you see there's a little orange sign underneath the speed limit sign. The orange sign says fines doubled, right? So a lot of people, they kind of, they hit the brake a bit, right, when they see that. And that's logical because they think, well, this is an area where it's going to cost me more to speed. And you have to think, why do they implement this arbitrary fines doubled at this point? Well, it's an orange sign, and the orange sign refers to the presence of construction workers. So they elevate the penalty to match up with the possibility of someone maybe getting killed while you're speeding, okay? So that's a perfect example of making the costs of crime greater than the rewards. The second point here, you promote fear of punishment. If people are driving on I-80 and they never get ticketed, they never get arrested, then people are going to start bumping up their speed and totally ignoring the sign. But if people know that the police will enforce that law and there's punishment attached, then people will toe the line, right? Another issue is making it difficult to find targets. Now, this is a kind of idea with rational choice, which means that criminals are, it's assuming criminals are rational, and that they will choose the easiest targets to find. So if you've locked down your stuff, if you've locked your car and you have a car alarm on it, it's not going to be as desirable a target as maybe another car that's unlocked with no alarm that will be much easier to get to, right? Punishment and incapacitation is going to prevent criminals from repeating crimes, okay? And that's a concept most people know, the idea of recidivism, the repeating of a crime after having been convicted. And if you punish people, if you put them away, isolate them, then that's going to prevent them from doing those things again, right? So that's presumably rational, of course, too, for a society in terms of spending money on programs and policies to deter crime and prevent it. And there are three big reasons why, in a just society, sanctions are necessary. We'll talk about that in the next slide. What are the three big reasons why punishment is necessary in a just society? I've outlined them here, and I'll briefly speak about each one. The sanction idea basically assures those people who are law abiders, right, non-criminals, assures them that they will not be shouldering the cost of other people's crimes. So, in other words, it's a question of fairness, right? If criminals can basically do what they want and take whatever they want, then the costs of those crimes come back to all the people who are not acting criminally. They suffer. So this is a proportionality issue and it's a fairness issue. So it's about justice, right? That's a key element to a just society, is that criminals are not allowed to get away with and cause greater costs for everyone else. The second reason that you need these kinds of things in a just society is by sanctioning activity, it confirms the norm. So if you say, all right, we are going to fine you if you travel over 75 miles an hour on Interstate 80, all right, if we actually do that, then that says, okay, this really is the norm. The norm is 75 miles an hour. Now here's the funny thing. Most people, when they drive on the interstate, they might ratchet it up a couple miles per hour, right? So they might go like 79. And they might do that because in Nebraska, they have 5 mile an hour cutoffs for when you get a ticket. So if you're going under 80, the ticket is not going to really cost you as much as it would be if you're over 80. And it might not even be enforced. So in fact, you know, because of this, the way that the actual sanction is set, the normative behavior is a little bit higher than the speed limit. So you can think about that if you're ever driving on that road, and think about justice. Okay. Third point is applying sanctions is a mechanism that ensures equality. Now, why do we need that? Well, if you were to go out today and if someone were to cut you off in traffic and you were to get ticked off and you got out of your car, you got your tire iron and you smashed up their car really good, right? You are enacting your own idea of what justice is. And of course, if you were to do that, if everyone who got cut off in traffic or felt violated in some way were to enact justice on their own, we would have complete and utter chaos, right? It could never work. So the criminal justice system allows us to give over our rights to the system. And they say, okay, we're going to have a uniform system that promotes equality of, for example, sentences, punishments, but it also allows for a procedure for fair treatment. Okay, so that's part of why we have these systems in order to accomplish all three of these things. And then we get to just desserts, which I explained a moment ago. The idea that the severity of the punishment should be commensurate with the seriousness of the crime. And that's really, in some ways, a cornerstone of our criminal justice system. It makes people angry when people get away with some crime and they don't feel like the punishment that's generally been accepted is in line with what the criminal did. Right? And that's going to lead us into some new concepts, terms for contemporary rational choice theorists, which I'll talk about next. There are several terms that Larry Siegel uses in his book related to contemporary applications of rational choice theory. One of them here is this notion of situational crime prevention, and it was enacted by a fellow named Oscar Newman. And he came up with this idea that if you create certain types of environments or structural kinds of characteristics, then you're going to inhibit some people from committing crime. So one great example I like to think of are these old-style apartment buildings for poor in some major metropolitan areas. And I'd like you to try to visualize this with me. You can imagine an apartment building where you have all the apartments on one side, okay? And you have a stairwell that goes up to each of the floors with the apartments. The apartments can't look out at each other or see each other. Some people would argue that that's a wonderful environment to promote crime, because what's happening there is that people cannot surveil each other, and they don't have an idea of what's going on in the space around them. By contrast, if you were to have, say for example, a horseshoe-shaped building, if you're looking from above, you see the horseshoe shape, and you've got windows on each of the interior courtyard facing apartments, then you've got a situation which naturally would inhibit crime, because people are able to look at the other people who might break into another person's apartment. Okay, so that's the idea of situational crime prevention. What kinds of things can we do with architecture, with lighting, things like this, to improve the lives of people, to make sure that there's less crime? That is this notion here, really, I've specified. Defensible space. Okay, so if you want to do things like defensible space, that falls into a type of situational crime prevention. So just like I said, defensible space, you can make use of, for example, lighting. If you have motion detectors on your lights that come on, that creates more of this defensible space idea. If you have a situation where there's more interaction, more surveillance, that's another great idea that inhibits criminals. Okay, so this is thinking in terms of the rational choices that criminals make. They see lights come on, they think someone's home. They see other people wandering around, they're more inhibited from doing an antisocial act. Right. There's also a notion here, this is a fun one, diffusion of benefits, which is when you have an effort to reduce one type of crime that unintentionally ends up reducing some other type. So a great example I think of with this is maybe, for example, if you have surveillance cameras, like we do in Kearney, at many major intersections. So maybe those were installed basically to record car crashes and to make sure there was a record of these kinds of things that could later be looked at in a form of documentation. But there might be some other diffusion of benefits from this. Like, for example, it could perhaps catch someone who would be in the act of drawing graffiti, maybe on a sidewalk. It could also inhibit people from jaywalking, perhaps, if that's something that we're interested in enforcing. Okay, so the diffusion of benefits, in particular, something like surveillance, has many benefits that might inhibit crime. There's an open question, though, which is we could probably use surveillance and we would be able to reduce a lot of people thinking about crime. But do you want to have a society where you're being surveilled all the time by cameras? And it's an open question. In England, they have more of that kind of surveillance-based society. They have cameras in many, many places, and they use them to find and locate criminals. But of course, at the cost of people feeling like they're being watched quite a bit. Discouragement is another contemporary term, and it's a diffusion effect, as I have here, which means basically that if somebody perceives one target to be limited, then maybe their thoughts about the other targets is they're similarly limited. So if you're at a car lot, for example, and there are cars where on the outskirts of the lot, the ones that are most accessible to people, they're all alarmed, then people might get the perception, a person who wants to steal the cars might say, oh, I've tried it with these most accessible cars, there's an alarm that goes off, I'm not even going to bother with the ones that are inside the lot. Okay, so that would be like a type of discouragement. Crime extinction is a strange term. Okay, most people think of extinction as when something goes completely away, right? Like the dinosaurs are extinct. That's not what crime extinction means. Crime extinction is this notion that if you have some type of reduction program, it reduces crime temporarily, okay? Temporarily. That, though, is only for as long as the criminals don't know how to beat that system. It goes back to original levels once the criminals learn how to beat that system. Okay? And so the example I think of with this is the kryptonite lock for bicycles. When the kryptonite locks first came out, they were very effective tools for inhibiting crime. And once criminals found out, oh, here's how you can break that lock, they became less so. So that's an issue we call crime extinction. A few other contemporary terms in your chapter. Crime displacement is an interesting concept. And this is the notion, and I like to think of it if you want to try to remember it, displaced, okay? You want to think about crime happening somewhere because of what's called, and I have it written here, situational inducements, okay? So let's say, for example, there's a lot of car theft on First Avenue in Kearney, okay? And it comes to be that criminals find out that most people are leaving their cars unlocked. So there are these situational inducements on First Avenue. People are leaving their cars unlocked. So people break in and steal them. If the police create a crackdown campaign and say, okay, we want everyone on First Avenue to start locking up their cars, then the situational inducement is removed. And that might then cause the criminals to say, well, it isn't as easy as it once was here, so we're going to shift our attention to some other target or area, right? So let's move it over to Central Avenue. And so this is in perfect line with the idea of rational choice thinking. Criminals can be thought of as rational too, and how they make choices may be influenced by, like for example, situational inducements. What's easy and accessible as far as stealing or theft. I talked about this a little bit ago, general deterrence and then specific deterrence. And these are important terms for choice theories. General deterrence is this idea of deterring people who might be criminal, okay? It deters everybody. So a general deterrence on Interstate 80 is that sign that says speed limit 75 miles an hour. Most people know, okay, if I go over that, I risk getting a ticket. Okay, that's general deterrence. It's a law that everyone pretty much is aware of. What happens, though, is that there are people who don't abide by that law. And so they might speed. And if they speed again, then we create what's called, or what's enforced, are specific deterrent ideas. And this is saying, okay, if you have sped before and you didn't learn your lesson the first time, then we're going to increase the penalty of that ticket. And we're going to increase it again if it's a third offense and a fourth offense, and eventually you'll lose your license perhaps. So there's the specific deterrence for people who didn't get the lesson the first time. Routine activities approach is something that really is mentioned more in your chapter 3, and maybe you could go back and look at that at another point. But this is something you'll find in the index of Larry Siegel's book, and it's useful to discuss. Okay? It makes use of rational choice ideas. The key assumptions here are outlined in these 3 bullet points. First one is that there are always going to be enough people who are motivated to commit crime. Okay? There are people all around you who might be interested in doing this. Right? The idea is if they find the right place to meet a victim, a suitable victim, or a good target, then they're going to commit crime. Again, I gave you that thought exercise at the beginning, which basically set up a situation where there are all kinds of people, and I imagine that out of the number of you who are taking this class online, some of you said, yep, I'd do it. So that proves this point in a way, that even people, who might not be induced, if they find the right kind of suitable victim or situational inducement, they might do it, right? So there is a pro to this theory that it takes the victim's actions into account, okay? You can do things to reduce your likelihood of being victim of crime. The con is, of course, this can't really work for victimless crime, because that's a crime where, of course, you're also a perpetrator. So this can't reduce, for example, gambling or drug use or prostitution. All right. There are three key components that influence criminal behavior according to this routine activities approach model. I'd like you to know these. The three components that you should think about, and you can look these up again using your index in the book. The first one, they talk about the idea of suitable targets. If there are targets which are suitable, then that will be an inducement for criminals to act. If you don't have suitable targets, if those are removed, then you reduce the likelihood of crime occurring, right? So suitable target would be something like a home that isn't locked or guarded or there are no people around, a car that isn't locked, the keys are left in the ignition, right? Those are very suitable targets. Items that are not marked, that don't have serial numbers, that type of thing. All of these things play into the logic of someone who wants maybe to commit a crime. Okay. The second component, the presence of capable guardians, is going to inhibit crime, and the absence of those guardians, of course, is going to promote crime. So, for example, parents, the presence of parents inhibits juvenile delinquency. The presence of police will give people cause to think twice about doing something wrong. Security guards in malls or other stores inhibit crime, and the presence of neighbors. Even, just a pair of eyes around the neighborhood can reduce the criminal's idea of, well, I should commit crime in this area, right? The third element to think about, motivated offenders. There might be, for example, teenage males, and the idea is, of course, they're at a point in their life when they're more likely to commit crime. We saw that in the previous discussion about how age and crime are related, right? Young people who are unsupervised. A key period of time for juvenile delinquency is that period between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. 3 p.m. is when kids often are getting out of school. 6 p.m. is maybe just before their parents get home. So unsupervised youth, that is a key period where juveniles are more likely to commit juvenile delinquency. And then, of course, things like maybe drug abusers, people who have an incentive to commit secondary crimes in order to get their drugs. So they might steal things to pawn them, for example. They're motivated offenders. They need that drug. So that might help them to want to commit crimes. So you can think for a moment about what type of tactics would deter crime based on routine activities approach. And what I like to think of is to just take that model and you turn it upside down and you think through, well, okay, here are the things that the approach argues, and then what are the things that would help reduce crime? First of all, you make your targets unsuitable. How do you do that? Pretty easy in most cases. You lock your doors. You lock up your objects like bicycles or even motorcycles. You write down serial numbers. You put things in places that people can see them. Okay, so you work hard at making your targets unsuitable. Part of this class, I hope, should be useful for you in your personal life. So if nothing else, you can take some of these ideas and maybe reduce your likelihood of victimization. Okay. Another thing, increase the presence of guardians. So if you want to inhibit juvenile delinquency, you make sure that there are people around juveniles a lot. If you want to keep your home safe, a lot of you probably do this already, you make sure somebody comes by and gets the mail. You also make sure that they look in on your place once in a while, right? Okay. Presence of guardians. People will inhibit other people from doing bad things. Finally, you can address underlying problems that motivate the motivated offenders. So, for example, we talked about drug users. They might be motivated to commit crime. So a policy implication there would be try to address drug use in your community. That'll reduce theft. Other things you can do, teenage youth might have nothing to do, and so you could create, as has been done in some urban areas, programs like midnight basketball programs that give young people something to do besides criminal activity. Right? In summary, things like choice theories, rational choice, and routine activities approaches all assume certain things. They assume that there is a general motivation to commit crime if the incentive structure, whoops, I drew through that, I apologize, if the incentive structure is right. Just like I gave you at the beginning of this set of slides. If the incentive structure is promoting crime, you'll see crime, right? The thing about choice theories, though, is they can't explain why some people choose crime and why other people might follow the law. Because even though I gave you a perfect incentive structure for committing crime, I guarantee you, out of the people taking this class, there are those who would say, I wouldn't do it. And they say they wouldn't do it for some other reason besides rationality, like I couldn't live with myself, those aren't my morals, right? I'll also talk a little with you about some of the problems with rational choice theory. Every theory that we look at has assumptions, and every theory has strengths and weaknesses. I would say theories are like tools. You wouldn't want to use a hammer for a job that requires a screwdriver. So rational choice makes certain assumptions about people, and some of those things may be true and some of them may not apply. All right, let's walk through some of the problems, okay, with this theory. One thing is, rational choice is often used by economists to predict consumer behavior. And it's this notion of a cost-benefit analysis, right? So the idea is that we're rationally oriented people who go around weighing the pros and cons of things, right? I really want to eat a donut, but I think, gosh, I'm going to get overweight and my pants aren't going to fit me anymore, so I'll need to work out more, and I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to eat the donut, right? We go through this logical series of ideas in our minds. The question is that really how human beings always, or even usually, think? How much of our thinking is rational, and how much of it is irrational, rooted in things like desire or passion? And that is the second part here. Can rational choice theories account for crimes of passion? And those crimes are referred to often as expressive crimes, okay? Crimes that are expressions of anger, for example, that may not fall under rational type of thinking. And you have to consider if everyone measures costs and benefits of things like pleasure, emotions, sensations, and feelings in the same way. Some people might do crime because it's thrilling. It certainly might play into the choices of crime that are made. Do people get a rush maybe from something like shoplifting, even if it doesn't make economic sense for them, even if they steal things they can't use, which sometimes happens? And so the question is to what extent do these things play a part in motivating criminals? How much of criminal activity is rationally motivated, and how much of it is driven by some other things entirely, non-rational stuff that also makes us human? You can also think to yourself about different subcultures. Subcultures promote different kinds of values. And so with different values, would you maybe have different measures for cost versus benefit? Okay? Is it possible that maybe if you're part of a gang, you would think very, very differently about the relationship you have to your gang and the loyalty versus the cost of, for example, committing a crime? Finally, let's talk about problems with the application of rational choice theories. Okay, the problems among them, they have 4 bullet points here. There is some evidence that the threat of punishment working is not necessarily true. One thing that we see quite often is people committing crime, even though they know it's illegal, even though they know they may be punished. So if this theory is so good, why doesn't that work? And again, that shows the strengths and weaknesses of the theory. It might apply to people who are very rationally oriented and who are able to control themselves. It might not for people who don't have those characteristics. There's also this notion here that in order to control people who are criminal, who act badly, we should use harsh punishment. The question about that is, though, does it actually work? Does it deter all criminals? In fact, no. Harsh punishment for some criminals doesn't seem to do much. And in fact, somebody might say, really? You're going to punish me hard? Bring it on, right? There are always some of those types of people. So there's a question about whether some of that, those sets of assumptions are realistic or true, and for how many people are they true. This one is a curious effect. If you are removing criminals from society, you're incapacitating them, as we talked about before. That does take them out of the social milieu, and they can't do bad things there. But the opportunity structures for crime are still there. And so in a sense, it just leaves those opportunity structures for potentially new criminals to step up and take advantage of those unguarded targets, for example. So incarceration means those opportunities are still around, and other people might then take advantage of criminal opportunities, right? Okay. A last implication, very important to think about for policy, is that if we're putting people in prison who are, like, say, for example, those ages where people are more likely to commit crime. I talked about ages 16 to 20, and I talked about age 18 in relation to property crime and violent crime being the spike times when those are the ages most likely to commit those crimes. If, for example, we put those people away for a long period of time, then you could ask, are they past their quote-unquote crime prime? In other words, are they past the age where they were likely to engage in those things? So punishing someone for a crime that they do when they're 18 or maybe 16, punishing them into their late 20s, early 30s, maybe there's this idea that they have aged out, or they're past the point where they're likely to commit crime anymore, as we talked about in a previous chapter. So if we do that, is it useful, or is it just a very expensive policy that drives our system and sometimes people's idea of retribution, when in fact those people are no longer really at high risk for engaging in crime or committing forms of social harm anymore? So rational choice theories, they have strengths, they have weaknesses, they make certain assumptions about people and human behavior, and it's useful to keep those in mind when thinking about what the theory can be used for.